everybody. Welcome once again to the second ever episode of Notes from the Aleph. An Aleph is a high point from which all things are visible, and from our vantage point, we'll be looking at tabletop role-playing games, their design, and the theory behind those designs. Around here, our motto is to be fair, build up, and have fun. I'm your host, GriffinVarro, joined here by our editor, Theta, our local designer, Norman Rafferty, and our good friend and GM, RedRabbit. When it comes to tabletop games, I have 15 years of experience running, playing, and frequently fixing the problematic rule sets at the table. Pronouns are he, him, and they, them. Rafferty, you go next.
Oh, yeah. Hello. I'm Norman Rafferty. I work for Sanguine Games. I have the gray hair to prove that I've been involved in a lot of really cool role-playing game projects and a couple dodgy ones.
And I'm RedRabbit. He, him, professional GM for 2 to 3 years and lover of all tabletop role-playing games.
All right, then. So today, let's see what we got over here. So, picture, if you would, the 90s. Once you're done soaking in all the radicalness, picture a young little Griffin sitting down to join his cool sister's friends group for some AD&D. They've whined and complained to join, and they've been reading religiously. They understand Thaco. So they make up a little halfling rogue to go on an adventure, and they have no idea what'll happen. They find a strange temple in the desert, go inside, and are immediately buried alive in a sand trap. Save or die. They die, the group outside wisely refused to wander into the trap, and the game moved on. Now, while this poor first dead character of mine could partially be to blame on his own experience, or perhaps some poorly thought out idea by the GM, the base mechanic of AD&D have long since been improved upon. Hitting armor now counts up instead of downwards. Classes now advance at the same rate, and halflings don't have to make a singular check to die quite so often as anymore. We can all recognize the changes to even just the Dungeons and Dragons alone as a step in the right direction, but despite a lot of things in our rules, people still look fondly back on those rules. Today at the Aleph, we forget our rose-tinted glasses at home, and we'll talk about why people like bad old game design.
I love bad old game design.
How's that for a segue?
Did you just call the 90s old school gaming?
I was.
Did you know Vampire comes from 1989?
This counts. It's close enough.
Younger than that game. Old man Rafferty already joins us on our little draw feed.
First edition Traveler.
So, I think, Rafferty, why don't you go and tell us what qualifies as old school gaming here, then? As the oldest person here.
Yeah.
Old man.
All right. If I had to break the ages of gaming down, like really Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, whatever. Okay. Old school gaming really ends when Vampire comes out. Because when you were going to conventions, people started showing up cosplaying as vampires. It was a lot easier to cosplay as a vampire. In the 90s, you just dressed like goths. You just go to Hot Topic, get a t-shirt, leather jackets, BDSM gear. You didn't have to get a foam sword or funny ears or anything. It was a lot easier. And they were all over the place. Okay? And that's the first nail in the coffin of old school gaming. The other nail in the coffin of old school gaming is Magic the Gathering. There's an excellent article called Death of the Minotaur, which is on salon.com, which explains that if you were like a young 8-year-old and you didn't understand how to play Magic the Gathering, there was a 900 number that you could call because the internet wasn't a thing yet. You could call this number and someone would explain to you very patiently how to play the game correctly. Now,
that is handy.
So I want to emphasize that. So the new thing was accessibility. The game should be something that people can understand because a vampire is you, but cooler. Mm-hmm. The game should be, have a low price point. Magic the Gathering, you get a booster pack for $5. Or someone might even give you their shitty deck. It was pretty easy to get into. It should be immediate. Magic the Gathering and to some extent Vampire were written very clearly with pop culture references or very small language, so you could get in very quickly. That's the end of old school gaming, because when you talk to people what they like about old school gaming, that's all the things they don't like. Right now, in the year in the BCE 2021, or sorry, in the current era 21, there's some flack going on where people are arguing over who owns the TSR trademark, since TSR, Tactical Studies Rules, was the original D&D publishers, and they're arguing too many people are in gaming now. It's important that we gatekeep and keep the undesirable people out.
Fuck that. Just
Right.
outright. It's like, people should play games and have fun. Get out of here.
Well, it's a curious sales ploy of, we don't want lots of people to buy our stuff. We want few people to buy it.
We want you, the elite gamer, to buy our elite gamer pad, which we just sell to everyone.
Right, because when Wizards of the Coast, who made Magic the Gathering, they started making D&D supplements. They made Magic the Gathering. Wizards of the Coast, still a thing. When Wizards of the Coast went to buy TSR and found TSR's warehouse, they found it full of unsold merchandise. TSR had crap tons of unsold merchandise. There's a lot of things you hear about Wizards of the Coast. The one thing you don't hear is their warehouse full of unsold merchandise.
Yeah.
So, so some of the questions are like if OSR, TSR, kind of screwed up, and old school gaming couldn't respond to this. And yeah, right here in the whiteboard, MTG and VTM of death, and the ultimate death is, speaking of the opposite of gatekeeping, is 2000 when Open Gaming License comes out. When when third edition came out, well, not when third edition came out, like fits and starts, they released the Open Gaming License so that people could make stuff. Like Pathfinder would not exist today if it weren't for Open Gaming License.
Absolutely.
So a whole bunch of other stuff that came out of it. So I would say that old school is anything that like old school gaming. What people are almost definitely meaning when they say old school gaming. This is also what's annoying about old school. They're almost always talking about Dungeons and Dragons, and specifically, they're almost always talking about basic Dungeons and Dragons, which is the offshoot of Blue Box. Like, I think it's not HOTS who wrote Blue Box. Who wrote Blue Box? Okay.
That is a good question.
The red box that everybody points to with the fancy cover, that's Tom Moldvay. I grew up on the 84 Moldvay box set. And that's a box I often reread to remind myself, because Moldvay's box set came out at the same time the television show came out and the big fad rise of D&D. It's an exemplar of what's really cool. Basically, the end of that will be the D&D Cyclopedia, which is edited by Aaron Alston, who's one of my personal gods of role-playing. And that is sometimes called the BCE, or BECMI fork. Do any of you remember that? Holmes, thank you. Someone just said Holmes in the chat. The Holmes edition.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, Eric
but there's
Holmes.
also sometimes called BECMI because there was the basic set, the expert set, the challenger set, the master set, and the immortal set, all of which had levels editing on top of each other. So and that was the Cyclopedia comes out. That's like a big unifying of that, because D&D also had two forks. People forget that. Speaking of gatekeeping and crap, Gary Gygax wrote another version of D&D that he or vague. I don't know if it's a new version or not, because you read D&D first edition, it's full of crazy crap that makes no sense. But he wrote another version of it labeled advanced and said, by the way, Dave Arneson had nothing to do with this, and I owe him no royalties at all.
That doesn't really hold up in court too well.
It did for many years. So I think when most people are talking, a lot of the games I see pushed as old school revival are almost definitely based off of the basic set and the Moldvay fork. Because they're using the simple 3 to 18 stats. They're using the original 6 stat lineup. They often have a single class rather than race tacked on to a class.
Right.
But I'm just going to forward here. It's also a lot of bullshit nostalgia for something that never existed.
Mm-hmm. So maybe that I can jump in on that
Go ahead for it.
because I think I'm well, when you have the old school game conversation, obviously there are contemporary games that are harkening back in that way. But I think that maybe there's this idea that that is only appealing to the grognards, to the old school gamers who remember those halcyon days. But I consider myself the kind of person who is definitely attracted to that idea. Whether or not it actually existed. When you tell me like, oh, here's a game where you could die instantly and you have to randomly generate your character and anything could happen, I am totally sucked in. So I'll be representing that corner of the naive, young, gullible gamer being drawn to this like a moth to flame.
Right, and there's clearly more marketing tactic in there because, like, making it arcane, it's like, oh, you can only do this if you're elite or understand, or it's like weird things will happen when you play. It's like, yeah, that's marketing, which I guess we should probably separate out a bit of the marketing because there's gonna be a lot of it involved in this talk.
Well, like before the streaming of it, like Angry Rafferty's always like complaining about these spoiled kids today, and they're fail forward, and everybody gets a trophy. Blah, 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 blah. But there's a lot to. I was always attracted to some of the more forward-thinking games, like GURPS, which wanted to be or Hero, two games that wanted to be a unified system, a big simulation where rules applied to everyone. The Ars Magica, which was written by Jonathan Twee, which is a name you should know because he was a chief designer of D&D 3rd Edition, and Mark Reinhagen, which Red should know.
Mark Reinhagen. Uh-oh.
He's the creator
He's a
of
sanguine
Empire.
guy. Oh,
hey,
no. Okay.
There you go.
Mark Reinhagen is the creator of the entire World of Darkness line.
Is this egg all over? No. I will say I'm a big fan of many game systems. I'm not much of a historian, so pardon my ignorance.
Like those are two guys. They wrote Ars Magica, which is one of my favorite games, and also like ushers in a new era of storytelling and role playing. They went different ways because Tweet went off with D&D and Mark Reinhagen went off to do Vampire and some other games you've never heard of. Because Tweet's also Everway, which is another discussion. But I mean, but I do go back and read some of the old school stuff. I'm curious about how Griffin's tastes run on this.
For like old school gaming, I think like my major interaction with old school gaming is definitely the revival phase of it, right? Where people have their idea of what those experiences were and then try to recreate them in new systems. And it's been really hit or miss, honestly. Like with some games or at least some experiences, they turned out all right. It's like, oh yeah, this is fun. Like we went through, we avoided traps, we had a good success attacking a giant snake, and everything went fine. And then maybe on that same module, I hear it's like, oh yeah, they got to the door and 5 people died because they touched some gems there. It's like, oh okay, that went terribly.
I'm going to be a big meanie here and point out that the old school revival is often just a big marketing term. Because the difference between what they call an OSR game, like people, I invite people to come in the comments, come at me. That there's a lot of people, like a lot of old school gaming I see is roll a d20 and try to beat a target number. And you have a character object that has hit points and you roll polyhedral dice. And when you run out, you're dead. Okay, that might be old school revival, but that's almost identical to d20.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to ask
what they're doing is selling you the feeling of it, which, as I said, there's going to be a lot of marketing here.
Let me ask, because I'm arguing I don't think there is a difference. What would you say is the difference?
Hard to say, really. What is the difference between new and old here? I guess the thing that gets thrown around the most is lethality. Which we recently had to talk about exceptionalism versus simulationism, and the way people would describe the old school would be a simulationist take on it, where you're a useless loser and you even have 5 other loser characters in your repertoire to throw into the funnel, and they all die and only the best one comes out on top unless everyone dies and the adventure ends.
I would usually call that the rogue-like mentality, where it's not
Good
so
word.
much that you are your character is not a special avatar that you customize. You rolled randomly, like Red said. This is what came up. Let's see how far we get. But what would you say? Do you have anything to add to that, Red?
I'll add that I love roguelikes as well. I mean, but yeah, I think that the things that have attracted me about these games that are the old school revival thing is it's probably a personal reaction that I have, and I'm sure that a lot of people have, to something we mentioned before, the Mercer effect or the exceptionalist game effect. This idea that characters can't fail, that the story is only fun so long as everything is going the player's way, and that even though we're rolling all of these dice, you never really have to worry. The dice are just there to validate the decisions that you make and to suggest that there is some element of fate involved in what's happening. And I find that I am more and more intrigued by this notion that the dice actually matter, that failure is an option, because to me that gives it a little spice. I'm also fascinated, and this is something else we talked about last podcast. I'm also fascinated about like what happens when there's failure. Is it just that everyone gets kind of like quiet and uncomfortable and breaks for soda or something, or can that generate a more interesting and fun game? And so I think these systems that say, hey, guess what? Don't get too attached to your character. Don't get too attached to this lovingly crafted backstory or this idea of being a grand hero is concerned. We get caught up in a lot of those ideas, and there's something to be said for like, hey, if 4 people go down into a dark cave and, none of them can see in the dark, so they're carrying torches, and any moment they could fall into a trap or something could jump out and eat them. That's drama. You don't need dragons. You don't need an epic medieval plot to make that interesting. The fact of embodying those characters in that scenario and rolling some dice and seeing what happens, that is very fun, and I think it's something that is largely absent from the way a lot of people enjoy these games today. So that's the attraction in a nutshell for me.
Oh, I would
Right.
definitely agree. I'm constantly cursing about how computer games have affected the way, because, like, for example, the concept of grinding.
Mm-hmm.
That is a post old school concept. The idea that we would go out of our way to go to a place where monsters mysteriously appear and then kill them, because repeatedly getting into murder will give us more experience points to level us up. I think this is one thing that a lot of old school revival games forget, is if you look at the text of old school RPGs, these monsters are going to kill you. It's not just D&D with these monsters that win the surprise round and get 6 attacks on you, or have like oh my god, my favorite monster is the Eye Killer. Have you guys ever seen this one?
Oh no, I haven't heard the Eye Killer.
The Eye Killer is an old school monster in D&D. If you shine light on it, it shoots the light back at you as a death beam that kills you.
That's pretty funny.
Wow.
And if you reflect the light back at it, it just gets more powerful for some reason.
Tell me this is also
that's
just save or
physics.
die too. It's like it happens and then you just die.
But you get a save. I mean, they're nice enough to give you a saving throw. But it's also like if you shine light on it, and it's invisible to like infravision, because infravision was the thing. But anyway, I mean, like, this is just one of the examples of what's that over there? I'm dead. Thank you for and it's like a low tier monster. It's like tier 2.
Oh yeah.
There's 10 tiers in classic. So it's that idea that you could just randomly get killed. Well, and also, like, I keep talking about emergence is the thing that I really like, which is what random stuff. And like in these original games, it's important to emphasize that old school gaming doesn't have necessarily a lot of choices that you're allowed to make with your character. In fact, many of them had almost no choices. Like if you rolled your stats on 3d6, and and certain combinations were required for certain classes. So if you didn't have a dexterity of 15 and intelligence of 15, you're not playing a monk today. You are not.
We could go into like rolling up the tavern keeper too. It's like, oh, all your stats are below 10. I guess you're the fighter who has 8 strength.
Right. You would pick that, and in theory, what you were supposed to do is you rolled that, took your lumps, win in the dungeon. But because you weren't putting a lot of choice into your character, You also didn't have a lot of investiture in your character, which means you didn't necessarily care if you got killed.
Exactly.
And but also like what I meant about grinding earlier is if you read the text, I got a little sidetracked. Sorry. You got points from treasure. Like you got experience points for identifying treasure, bringing treasure back, and like statues and stuff. Which is why when you look at these early games, they have huge sections devoted to encumbrance. They have huge sections devoted to henchmen and hirelings to do combat for you. You could hire people to fight with you, and then you hire people to carry loot. There's that spell that keeps showing up in D&D that no one knows what it's for. Tenzer's floating disc.
Oh yeah.
Like everyone asks, like, what is this for? It's to hold your treasure, stupid, because your treasure is worth more than monster lives. You were supposed to take all of this. You were supposed to go to the dungeon, loot the stuff, carry all the stuff home, get it identified, sorted, and sold, and then you earned experience points from that. And then the other thing that people forget, you had to pay to train because you did not automatically level up. That cost money.
And I think like the experience we've had the closest to that lately over on our channel was Hackmaster, which I think Rafferty you're slightly familiar with. I don't know if you are.
Hackmaster is literally Hackmaster is the OSR before there was OSR. It's literally copied and pasted from D&D.
Yeah,
basics.
and I think though this is a newer edition, it has all those tropes. And I gotta say, man, it was a rough experience. Like I think we were all having fun, but the game itself, as per rules, it's a bit miserable, isn't it?
They have the knockback now. Well, you also like in fact, Hackmaster is what I would like call like Hackmaster is literally copy and pasted OSR written by people who love old school gaming.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why when you go to play it, you go, "Oh my god, this is incredibly unplayable and complicated." But we're still having fun.
Is it? We had an entire setup on Roll20 to automate like half of it.
Yeah, you guys hate fun more than I do. I'm not saying that people can't have fun playing it. I'm saying like that's not that's not what people are remembering. People are not having fond memories of going through and loading up all of those guys.
Right. The statement I made to someone else earlier, I think Theta, was that like I wouldn't do this at the table. This is too much.
When we did the Joe Gennaro newsletter, I went and put in the advertisements that people were selling for time use forms and time use programs, because in D&D they had a speed at which you explored each room, so you had to write down what that was because you're going through food and torchlight. You were supposed to track your time. This is all this stuff that if you can find the rules for it, but this gets to the big thing about OSR, which is the thing that I always argue about, where they always say,
"Here it comes."
We can use whatever, if you don't like a rule, ignore it. Do whatever you want. GM, whatever. It's your experience. Make it. And then period. By the way, here's 200 pages of rules on 16 different kinds of pole arms that are different speed factors. Here's how fast you move through a dungeon. Here's my favorite armor effects on character width. No offense to Douglas Niles, who recently had a Kickstarter to make the Dungeoneer Survival Guide. But if you guys have been sitting there going, I wonder how wide my character is, let's look it up in the book.
It's pretty good.
Well, you mean you don't love rolling up every single vital statistic of your character?
That might be where I check out.
30 minutes to character.
The Dungeoneer Survival Guide, they did a new version of it. It's probably better, but Dungeoneer Survival Guide was our poster child of worst old school book. Because it's got all this stuff in it. How wide is your character? How long does it take to dig a tunnel? It's like all this stuff that is a whole bunch is the stuff that was in the unsold warehouse, because it's like none of you care. There's a great story where we had one of the Ironclaw players and we started arguing about how long it took to dig a pit. And one of our Ironclaw playtesters pitched a fit, like, why are you arguing about this?
I think in our Arcade Claw, we actually had a whole discussion about how long does it take to take a tree, turn it into lumber, and how much value is that worth?
Right, and you can tell the difference between old school and new school, they would just look at you. So yeah, getting to that kind of stuff. There's a lot to recommend old school, and I'm going to be, once again, the narrating nabob and point out there's also all the stuff about old school that is bad that what annoys me, it doesn't get talked about. And
Sorry, before we get to that, because I want one more thing to say, and I don't want to
yeah,
complete
I'm gonna-
the topic before we do, is that I will say, yes, it sounds awful measuring character widths and comparing them to widths of doorways and stuff, but I would still prefer that to the featureless corridor. Do we go left or do we go right? For like, when you're in a modern dungeon setting, if any of you guys have found yourselves in this position, you're exploring the dungeons of the Mad Mage, let's say, and it's you're 3 hours into your game session. It is literally the 25th time the dungeon master says, "Well, you go left or you go right," and there's literally nothing else to
Oh
to
gosh.
go on.
I've
That
had that experience very recently,
Are you
actually.
saying that is OSR or that's not OSR?
No, I'm saying that's modern. That's modern dungeon crawling because so much of this is stripped out. I might rather have conversations of encumbrance and of burrowing through walls and the time that it takes than have that just arsenic
I thought
death
you
of
were talking-
everyone's
no.
city.
So I'm going to contradict you on that because there's one thing you forgot to mention. If it's a modern dungeon, they'll describe the light sources that are on the walls. That drives me crazy.
Oh yeah,
Every dungeon
Oh,
published after 2010, someone
Fantastic.
like I was complaining about a Pathfinder adventure where, well, here we are in the Goblin Stronghold. They've hung torches on the walls because it says they've hung torches on the walls. Really weird for creatures who can see in the dark, but
right.
that was handy.
Maybe they like a
Oh.
bit of mood lighting, It sets the theme for the dungeon.
And
Yeah,
wouldn't you know it? Everyone in our party has night vision, has dark vision, so it's all moot.
Yeah, well, that's also in fact, that's how I would sum up OSR, which is a bunch of rules about illumination. By the way, everyone can see in the dark.
Yeah.
Because
So,
everyone.
anyway.
So like the things that always bother me about this, there's the problems with OSR people don't talk about, which are I always want to call those the Elminsters and the Robillars.
Who's Rabbelar?
Okay, well.
We're about to hear.
Elminster, to clarify for everyone, is Elminster is Ed Greenwood's own insertion in the D&D setting, where he's a centuries-old human. Now, this is always a weird thing. Every version of D&D, from the OSRs to the modern ones, they always include aging rules. Have you guys ever, like no one cares about aging rules. Everyone's
No
like,
one uses them, but yeah, they're there.
The ghost
I
is
have
an aging
tried my
attack.
hardest in a recent campaign, and it'll never happen.
Right, but it's important that it's in the book. Like they have a whole page devoted to because you all do this, right? When you make your character, you roll your maximum age. It says to do that.
I think other recent ones say roll it once you start getting close, which means that they never intend you to do it.
Because they finally realize no one does that. Also, because I'm showed up with an 80-year-old character, no one does. Anyway, but moving on from there, so they're always adamant saying nothing but the intervention of a god can stop you from dying at this old age number. And then Elminster shows up, by the way, he's centuries old. How is he centuries old? He's human.
Because he has bedded a god, my friend. That guy's got connections.
Yeah, he bedded the goddess of magic who made him immortal. That was very handy. So what I'm using him as an example, and Drizzt's like this too, is you'll always run into somebody who tells you about their old school character who, by the way, they just made up a reason why they're more awesome than the rules could ever make them.
Oh, yeah.
But like Elminster is master of all these magic. By the way, there's nothing in the book that says that could happen. He just is.
Yeah, there's no character sheet for Elminster, because if there was, he would be defeatable.
Well, there is for 3rd edition, and it's hilarious.
Oh,
he has plus 10 con because the goddess said so.
There you go.
Ark brings up one. 4 staging monsters.
That was handy. Or characters like Drizzt. Like somehow Drizzt has the inherent ability to levitate, despite the fact that's impossible in the rules. He just does. And this is what I usually use as an example of almost everybody who has an awesome old school story. Eventually, you'll get to the house rule that made their character awesome, and or just made up thing that just made them cooler than everyone else. And that's what always annoys me, because that's inauthentic to the experience. If the idea was, you enjoyed an old school game because of all the reasons you guys just mentioned, it's random. You don't know what you're going to get. You could die at any time. If that's the reason why you enjoy it, then then Elminster is a poor character because he's been blessed with extra special abilities that make him less fun.
Right, you could never aspire to be Elminster. I mean, I guess aspiring to bang a magic god is a thing, but you're never going to get to.
Well, so can I make
a strange table?
Sure.
I mean, hey, if you're into that, right? If everyone's comfortable, but can I make a weird argument here that I'm sort of fleshing out as I'm
Of
saying it?
course,
So
we're all
apologies.
weird.
So, what about negative space, right? What about in these systems where these things are so, everything is so simple or sort of cut and dry, right? So you're rolling your dice, you've got your random ability scores, you're barely competent enough to wield a sword, but you're going to do it and you're going to survive. This character miraculously makes it, right? And there's rules that will tell you how your character will grow in strength as they go through the laborious leveling up process, but they're never going to be amazing in the way that an Elementor is and stuff. But I think that is an area where the reason that has happened, the reason why all of these characters that came from that era of gaming have these ridiculous abilities is because in that negative space, the GMs just started coming up with crazy, goofy stuff, right? They were like, oh, you know what? Yeah, you get like another, I don't know, plus or minus to your THACO or whatever that would be, right? But how about you also find this item that's doing truly outrageous, strange things? Or, your character meets up with this goddess. Turns out the barkeep was a goddess, and now he's got like some other interesting hook.
Mm-hmm.
It's weird to say because, again, I know to Rafferty's point, none of this is written down. And really, to do that might cheapen it. I mean, when you look at our modern, magical item lists, there's a lot of things that are like truly head scratching, like a decanter of infinite water. And who could want that? I mean, maybe you would if you're tracking your water intake.
If somebody thirsty really wants that.
Right?
Let's
yeah.
not get into like you're playing Dune and you got the still suit now.
Yeah,
there you go. Yeah.
Recursive
just a quick
functions.
side comment. Griffin and I play a lot of Ironclaw, and people just say like, "Oh, this magic's useless in Ironclaw. What if this spell? It just makes it rain. That's totally useless."
No, but that's amazing, right?
That farmers disagree with you.
That has value in a true simulation game because
I mean,
it would have value to the players and to farmers.
So you're right. Or Matic of the Titans is another one, which allows you to like dig vast quantities of dirt.
Yeah.
Which it would be useful if you had any kind of construction. Holy crap.
Sure, it would be incredible, but when you have narrowed the game down to being just basically killing monsters, and maybe it started from this point, then you get into a situation where a lot of these magical items essentially are workarounds for holdups in the rules to kill monsters, right? So this gives you bonuses to your attack to hit or to damage. This magical item means that you get to make saving throws or take less damage when you fail saving throws. All of them are workarounds for that system.
Mm-hmm.
But when the systems were simpler, and I'm not speaking from experience, this is just theory, right? But I think when the systems were simpler, when there was less tinkering happening there, that might have created this negative space where people decided to fill it with crazy, weird stuff. It's a miracle that your character survived to the 10th level of this dungeon. We got to give him something else than just, more carrying capacity. And that's where all this weird stuff came from. And I kind of like that. I think that's very interesting because it has value to the players.
I would agree with you there, and I think that's one of the things that people praise about old school gaming. I like to talk about before the rules were set,
right?
Which is or as one like game critic once pointed out, it's like, how is generic fantasy a phrase? Like everyone has the same fantasy can be anything. Why would it all be the same?
So I guess ultimately because Tolkien's been boiled down over the years into a viscous goop that everyone just uses.
Well,
just apply to your forehead.
Like Game of Thrones is a fantasy, but it's like it's almost historical.
It's really specific.
You could almost delete the fantasy elements from it and it would be a historical epic, but then no one would care because there's no dragons.
War of the Roses, right?
Yeah. It's not Lancaster and York, it's Lannister and Stark. I mean, it's right there. But like another example of this would be if you ever go back and watch the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon show.
Ooh.
Because
boy.
Here is a show that is ostensibly based off Dungeons and Dragons. Now, Tenzer, Mordenkainen, all bags of holding, all that crap, that's not going to show up. But instead, there can be weird stories such as the demon that steals children from under their beds and has them working on this clock to keep the hands from turning because whoever strikes midnight, he'll die. Or, I mean, like, wow, that's epic. Or there's literally like a giant who lives in the clouds who's stealing children was a common thing.
Arguably, that's more like representative of the D&D experience, up to and including the gnome DM who pops in and is an asshole.
Well, but what I'm getting at is like you watch that show and like, wow, this all sounds like real cool epic adventure. Then you go play D&D, even old school
And none of
D&D.
it's there.
They didn't, with like one precious exception, they never took those episodes and translated them. You can't buy a module that is the one where you save the aliens to get back to their spaceship so they can fly back to their home planet. You can't buy any of that. It's like they totally bungled that. So,
Yeah, you
but
gotta go
moving
play
on,
Ultima instead.
yeah. So I agree that like that kind of joy. It sounds like we could because it doesn't have a lot of rules. We could do all this kind of joy. But I think another problem is like people have fond memories of that, but there's a lot more Elminsters than there were the grand designs that you're talking about, and also those were usually like the end of the game too. And people are not talking about the 15 to 20 characters who all got mulched on the way there. Like one of the reasons why I'm objecting to Elminster is Elminster was probably Ed Greenwood's first character. Like he did not get there. Which brings me to the second character I always want to talk about, which is Robilar.
Yeah.
I think I'm pronouncing
There
this
we go.
right. Robilar was one Robilar D&D. Who played Robilar? I always forget. It's a big one. He's in the Greyhawk. See Rob Kuntz's character. Robilar is one of the Greyhawk characters, but he was also somebody's actual player character. And
one of those like
Circle
Circle of
me
Eight
who
guys.
actually played him at the moment.
Circle of
Because it's on the
Nine.
wiki, of course.
Shame.
But the reason why I'm mentioning Robilar is because Robilar was he would play his player would play a lot of solo adventures with Gary Gygax. And in the original old school, there's Rob Kuntz there. I knew he was a big name. They just found it for me. Rob Kuntz, who is a big name in D&D design. He was one of the major designers. So Robilar like would solo entire old school dungeon. And the reason why he get away with this is because in old school gaming, there's not a lot of skills. There's not a lot of make a skill roll to get past this, which is what the fail forward people complain about, where it's like, like maybe there might be a roll to open a door, but there's no, unless you're like, if you just want to move silently and never be detected, you can just put on Boots of Elvenkind. In old school D&D, Boots of Elvenkind make you completely silent. We're done. There's no skill roll. So if you put on a Cloak of Invisibility and Boots of Elvenkind, you can wander around completely unmolested.
And then Gygax is going to show up and say, well, my monster automatically sees everything anyway.
No. That's the crazy part. Gary Gygax was Rob Kuntz's GM.
He was like, let this one
That's why
ride.
he's so bitter.
But what I'm getting at here was the strength of old school gaming is because everything's in broad strokes. But that's also the problem with it, because everything's in broad strokes. Once you start to figure out how it works, you can just break it.
Yeah.
And I think to bring up like a design topic thing, when it comes to like video game design, those kind of things are frequently called intangibles or incomparables. Incomparables is what they are. So instead of having a generic stat increase like you would in modern D&D where you like plus 10 yourself, you are now silent is a descriptor on whatever thing that you're doing. You can't weigh the difference, but you can't weigh the value between being able to be silent and being able to be invisible between each other. That's why they're
there's a big difference between having a random chance to be hit and a freaking iframe. Right. So if you got these special items in the world, like those boots or whatever, you could start solving a lot of problems automatically. There's an excellent scene in the man, I'm so old. There's a movie called E.T. It was a big hit. You guys ever hear about that?
No, I don't think so. I think they filled a
One
garbage
of the big
dump full
deals
of a game.
E.T. is all the kids are sitting around the kitchen table playing Dungeons and Dragons, and there's a novelization of the movie, so it goes into great detail about the D&D game they're playing. I highly recommend it. It is awesome.
Do tell what is there if it wouldn't spoil it.
Short answer: they have a portable hole, because a portable hole solves all of your problems in D&D.
Yeah, there you go.
So they just go hide in a hole. Honestly, great idea. I love it.
Right. And because the portable hole automatically gets through any wall, it can also be used to trap monsters. You can hide inside it yourself.
So it's better than it is now.
Right. But what I'm getting at is a lot of old school games like had the idea that if it's something you can describe or something you have the tools to do, you just describe it and then it happens.
Yeah.
It's not a modern game would often have skill tests. Like when D&D 3rd edition comes out, it's not invisibility means you're undetectable. It's invisibility as a +10 to a stealth roll, which means you'll probably succeed.
Right.
But
I
you
think
might
we see
not.
more of that in, say, like the Powered by the Apocalypse games, or like in Blades in the Dark, or
I
the
was gonna
monster
get
one
to
we're
that.
doing.
Because Powered by the Apocalypse is because I started every year or so I go back and reread an old school game. And Powered by the Apocalypse, like I noticed, Powered by the Apocalypse has skill rolls in it, but it's a lot more like an OSR game because like something you'll see in a modern game is tiers of difficulty. Like if you go play Vampire or whatever, they'll say like, you know, you need 1 success to seduce the groupie, but you need 3 successes to seduce the bouncer because the bouncer is more resistant.
Right.
You won't see that in an old school game. Like in an old school game, either it's something that can or can't happen. Like it'll just say this is never a surprise, or it'll
Right,
just
a
be
lot more
some flat
binary
random
about it.
chance. Like a cougar surprises people. A cougar is only surprised on a 1 in 12 chance. It'll just say that. And it just says, or elves are 90% resistant to charm spells. What does that mean? Does that mean they're only 10% charmed, or does it mean they have a 90% chance to resist? And also, like it's 90%. Just pick a number. It's 90%. It's not they get like if you look at 3rd edition, it'll be they get a bonus to resist charm. But in earlier games, flat. But what I'm getting at here is like old school games were often either arbitrary or automatic. And so if you could describe it or say you were doing it or something like that, it would automatically happen. That's very freeing because it means like instead of like it's always a bummer to come up with some clever plan, but then it fails because of a die roll. People hate that. That doesn't happen in old school gaming because you have a clever plan, you describe it, the GM says, "Oh, okay, all right."
And I think maybe that's the part people have a lot of nostalgia goggles for, right? It's I got to say I did the really cool thing, and then I did the really cool thing. I'm so clever, I solved this dungeon by being clever.
There wasn't a separate section of the book devoted to climbing and swimming. Therefore, if I just described how I knotted the rope and put it on spikes and climbed up there, because I described it in a practical way, the GM let me get away with that. And I would agree with you that people have nostalgia for that, but I'm here on the podcast being annoyed because people don't vocalize that. They're not saying that's what they remember.
Right.
And there's downsides to that because then you run into the descriptor player, because you'll run into players who meticulously describe everything they do.
That's me.
They don't want to get caught making a mistake. And they also think that if they describe it in detail, this is where the joke of the 10-foot pole came from. Because like a lot of people joke, like, why is a 10-foot pole equipment? Because you poke the ground in front of you with the 10-foot pole to set off the pit traps. Because if you didn't say you were doing that, you randomly blunder into the pit traps and take damage that you could have avoided if you said you had a 10-foot pole. And like even in the 1980s, they were joking about players who had 10-foot poles and communicated only in sign language so they wouldn't alert monsters to their presence. Which, I mean, you guys laugh, but making call signs in video games and tactical games is considered really hip now. So
no, I mean it's kind of beautiful, the creativity that came out of that. It's like you're applying sort of optimal game strategy to just a kind of an open-ended blank scenario. The problem is that at a certain point, every one of those circumstances are going to be solved. And then you get into issues where, like, was it Tomb of Horrors, where all of the puzzles are terrible logic puzzles. They almost have nothing to do with the mechanics of the game and the character sheets, because it was more about stumping players than it was about testing their character builds.
Oh, yeah. Like, the big one I always point is the door that has the glowing panels and it describes what colors they glow in. That's meaningless, though. It's just 1, 2, 3 to open it.
There you go. Yeah.
A bigger example is this was Justin Bundle Holding recently was Flying Buffalo, which made Tunnels and Trolls. Tunnels and Trolls is the big old school game that everyone forgets about. because Tunnels and Trolls was huge for a while, and then eventually, in a roundabout way, became the core of the Fallout engine.
Oh, interesting.
But
Very roundabout right there.
yeah, I mean, it's but that's the big legacy it has today. But Grimtooth's traps, they started making the second generation traps that are designed to kill you. It's one thing to point out, like in Indiana Jones, where so if that boulder rolls down and smashes everything at the front of the room, how are we supposed to get back in here? But then you get Grimtooth traps are, if I take a pole and poke the chest with it, the walls that are 10 feet away smash together, leaving the chest completely safe.
Right,
Or my
it's a
favorite
big trap.
the spikes on the ceiling and the reverse gravity trap that takes you up there. I've seen that in multiple dungeons.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, we're gonna violate physics to kill you.
Yeah, just to trick the players, because every time you encounter that in a game, you're now like vaccinated to that particular trick. So then, but you are taking that knowledge forward. Like that's a way of character advancement. It's player advancement. There's spikes on the ceiling. Everybody, like cling to the walls. Everyone like tie yourself to the floor. Like, again, that at a certain point you run out of rope with that though.
Well, except that like after you figure that out though, then it's annoying. Like the D&D old school games have a problem with illusions and the concept of disbelief. Like in D&D, they said any illusion seems to be real if you interact with it. So if I don't interact with it, then it doesn't affect me because I'm not interacting with it. So,
and you can only tell it's not real if you do interact with it. And it's always been like a big, strange spot in all rule sets from then on.
I disbelieve at things. So, you can see through them. And like D&D 3rd edition has a huge section devoted to that because, if you read through, like some people might read D&D 3rd edition going, why do they have all this talk about different kinds of illusions? Because they're all over the place in 2nd and 1st.
Yeah.
Because everything's a freaking illusion in 2nd and 1st.
Right, and one of the modern problems with like illusions is like, well, how do you find them? It's like unless you're describing, you're actively trying to look for them, the disbelief thing, or just experimenting.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a huge problem. I've got this person sitting across the table from me, like this RedRabbit guy. We hired him to lie to us. He's sitting here lying to me. He's telling me I'm some kind of adventurer in a dungeon. I'm not. I'm a person. I'm not an adventurer with a sword. So you have this double lie problem of I only know what the DM is telling me is in the world. If the DM lies to me about what's in the world because it's an illusion, it's not like a video game where I could look for a misaligned texture or poor lighting or anything like that. I can only go by what the GM is telling me. And the GM goes, psych, the floor was illusion. You fall through it on spikes. It's like, how was I supposed to know this? How is this? And that's the kind of thing about old school gaming that nobody talks about.
Well, we still struggle with that to a degree. Traps, even modern traps in modern games tend to be very vague about, you can roll this to discover it and you can roll this to disable it. But like, do they discover it just by walking into the room? Do they have to investigate the area of the trap? When players walk into a room, in every room, they just say, I roll perception to, I don't know, perceive things.
What you just said, I roll perception to see illusions, is not an old school gaming conceit. In old school gaming conceit, you would say I disbelieve, and if you blundered into an illusion, you blundered into it. There's no provision for that.
Yeah. Oh, it's still something that we're struggling with though in some ways. Like I feel like what I've learned from this conversation is that a lot of the modern mechanics that we use today were solutions to the dead-end roads of these old school games that made them more interesting and more engaging. But I can see that there are areas where that still hasn't been totally codified yet.
Well, that's why I think when they call that revival, so that's another reason why I was yelling that a lot of old school revival is really D20, because D20 was because like 2nd edition D&D has the problem that they wanted to clean up D&D 1st edition, but they still wanted to have all the OSR the old school problems that we mentioned. Like they still have the illusion problem. They still have the the randomly generated, like if you didn't roll a 15 or better on your stats, you're basically boned. And all these other problems. They were getting there, but they weren't. The genius of D20, the basis for D&D 3rd edition and later and Pathfinder, was that the designers like Jonathan Tweet sat down and said, what's fun about old school gaming? But how can we make it more modern? And like you hit the nail on the head of let's, instead of making everything, just an arbitrary thing you describe, let's put a modern skill system into it where you make rolls. And D&D 5th edition is even better at it, where it's got fewer skills and bigger stat rolls. But I mean, you can see the seeds of that, like in Holmes's edition of D&D in his basic set. He proposed the idea of attribute rolls, of rolling a d20 against your 3 to 18 attribute to try and do weird things. And he also proposed giving attributes to monsters, something that D&D fought for years. Like, it's not for second edition and first edition, they never give monsters attributes. They're really angry about it.
They have attack bonuses and how much damage they do, but no, nothing else.
Yeah, no.
Intelligence rating.
Yeah, the intelligence rating. It's like they're very angry about that. It's not until D&D 3rd edition. And so a lot of stuff that people are calling old school revival is really like D20 with some of with invoking, like Red said, some of the nostalgia of that era before all the rules were set when we had broad things. But they're really, like you just said, they're really D20.
Speaking of ways that old school has kind of like continued into time, I think board games are probably a good place to look, because like a lot of the things that people say that they want about it is all those rules and sets and dying and failure. And you can see that a lot in, say, like Descent, the board game, where you have a player playing the dungeon master who draws cards and has powers, and then you have each player who plays a character who draws a card, has powers, moves around the board in a very RPG-like kind of scenario. But it's very clear what the boundaries of that game are, what the rules are, what scenarios can possibly happen. And when you work as a group, it often ends up more like a puzzle game than specifically like an RPG. But that's a fun experience in itself. You can play it and you can fail. And I've failed to actually beat the person who runs as a DM in that game very frequently. He's very good at it.
No, I'm thinking more. Gloomhaven is the current darling. Where that's concerned, and Gloomhaven is a board game. Like literally, they have this weird thing where if you don't pick up treasure during the fight, it disappears.
Yeah.
But so they're a board game. But no, I mean, I think there's good lessons to take away from OSR. But I think the last thing that usually annoys me about OSR is I think a lot of people are forgetting about the random sense of entitlement that came out of those. Because, like, have you guys played an old school game that had psionics in it?
Does 3rd edition count?
I was about to
psionics there.
No, it doesn't.
They were completely different rules from what I understand.
The way psionics used to work in D&D was there was a random 1 to 3% chance that your character had psionics. You rolled it, and if you had psionics, you got access to a whole new power set that was just added to your character.
Wow.
Nice.
Now, the reason why I say 3rd edition doesn't count, because 3rd edition, you chose to be a psionic character, and you leveled up.
Yeah.
In a lot of old school games, like D&D Psionics, which in D&D devoted a huge space to it. Like if you read D&D First Edition, every monster has its psionic potential listed. Despite
I'm remembering that now. It's all coming back to me. It's like roll percentage chance for the monster to be psionic. It's like, all right, so what does that mean? Its powers are not psionic. It's like, so what changes? It's psionic. It's okay. It means nothing in AD&D.
But also for players, if you rolled you had psionic powers, you suddenly got a random power. And it could be something minor, like a direction sense, or one of my favorites, somebody rolled and says, okay, you get one power, any power you pick one out of the book, and all of its prerequisites. Pause. You start going through the book and finding, so in AD&D 2nd edition, in case you're curious, the power that gives you has the most prerequisites is teleportation trigger. Because in order to get that, you have to have all of the teleportation powers, because you have to be able to teleport, and all of the ESP powers.
I can't think of a less balancing mechanic than to turn literal gates to progression into bonus powers. That's amazing.
And that's the thing I'm always harping on about. It's not just the Santa Claus DMs, as they used to call them, just giving you, you're Elminster, you have plus 10 con now.
I think they start with multi-hull later on. But
sometimes the games had written into them, like Traveler. Everybody talks about Traveler, you can die in character creation. Yes, but in Traveler, you could also start with the ability to mind control people. So people don't talk about it. And if someone showed, like you talk about how if I had a crappy roll, but someone would show up with all 18s, or someone would show up with I rolled and I have psychic powers, I have molecular agitation at will, I rolled it randomly, therefore I'm entitled to keep it. And that's what Rafferty always remembers as old school gaming, because there are so many games like that just some characters, just because they randomly got an awesome power, they were allowed to use it. And that's one thing no one talks about from old school gaming, because everyone hated those characters, but they can't see them with the rose-colored glasses.
But that should be the one that person is talking about the most, the time they got the random power and were so cool. I guess all the other party members killed them.
There are and there are people who talk like that. I mean, in fact, some of the times if you dig deep enough in some people's stories, they eventually reveal that they were like, "Oh, by the way, I had all 18s."
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, there you go.
So basically, my thesis here is that I think that there's good stuff to take away from old school gaming. Like you said, the idea of grand ideas and the idea of not feeling like I need to be restrained, that everything needs to be like tiny nickel and diming bonuses. Like, what if things worked in broad strokes? And I think you're seeing that return in games like Wicked Ones, I think, especially.
Mm-hmm.
Everything we do in Wicked Ones is supposed to be defined in big, broad strokes. But they're very careful in Wicked Ones to say that for every positive, you should also list some kind of negative. Like, okay, this steals people's memories, but using it drives people insane. Or,
there you go.
Yeah, stuff like that. Or, using this item, it's powerful, but it can also be addictive. Or
and
this coin
that's fun gameplay.
Yeah, this coin always returns to your pouch, but it also wants to find other people's pouches to be in. So, like that kind of stuff. Instead of what I often see in old school gaming, which is this sword is cursed to stab you, but it performs as a regular sword. Like that's another thing. Third edition gaming took out cursed items.
Yeah.
Third edition
Theoretically there, but yeah, they stopped appearing.
Third edition puts them in the optional rules. Fourth edition removes them.
Yeah. So
yeah.
So I have a question then, because
why don't you do the wrap-up question here too?
Yeah.
Okay, this could be the wrap-up question then. It's kind of a broad topic, so I want to hear from both of you anyway. So we've identified there are aspects of old school gaming that are carried forward or that we like, and there are aspects that we find to be problematic. Is there a way to change the definition or a way to redefine those elements that we like to separate it from the old school label? Do you think we need to change the nature of the definition, or do you think that it is what it is and it's not changing? And I guess I'd ask Rafferty first what he thought about that.
I mean, I'm not supposed to break kayfabe here. I'm not supposed to say like, as a merchant, we'll say whatever you want as long as you buy our stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Do it. Give in to your anger.
I mean, like I'm always complaining with the video game reviews where they, like we've made a new game. It's like Castlevania and all these other games you really, really love. Then they'll be like 12 entries long. What I have come not to praise Caesar, but to bury him. I think what it's better to do is to go back and ask ourselves, like looking for different terms. I'm happy with telling people, really safe and buy this stuff. But more practically, what I think we need to do is, I think there's a lot of OSR games. There's a lot of OSR games that are just masquerading as, old school revival and just saying they are. Because if they actually were using, there are a few games that use these old school things I was talking about, like the random entitlement or the element string or that kind of, or the illusion, that kind of crap, or Hackmaster. I apologize to the fans. Like you said, it's like most people don't want to play that, and if you expose someone to that as their OSR game, like they would never come back to it ever because modern gamers would hate that. But also, I think what we need to do is learn the lessons of it. And I think some modern games like Blades in the Dark and Powered by the Apocalypse have learned the good lessons of those games, which is try to present ideas in broad strokes. Stuff should have immediacy and understanding. And one of my favorite phrases, stuff should work. Like if you have a special ability or a special clever plan, the OSR everyone wants to remember are when the clever plans were rewarded and stuff just worked without necessarily making people make a die roll and making it blow up in their faces and that kind of stuff. And people also remember the simplicity. So I would suggest that those are the lessons we should learn about old school gaming and get rid of some of the excesses. We didn't talk about a lot of the modern excesses, but that's what
Yeah.
we should be taking away from it. And and I would just encourage folks to like I know people are going to keep saying it's old school revival to buy that, but in this current time period where we have very terrible, I must emphasize, terrible bad people saying that old school gaming was very exclusionary, very stereotyped, and just very mean spirited. Um, it's made me come off of my rocking chair and say that wasn't always true, or that there's still good things.
And I guess over here, I mean, naming is names, and if you want to play old school games, or what we're calling old school games, those still exist. You can go play them at any time that you want, but you probably won't.
That's a fair point. It's not like these things have been purged from
But
the
you
internet.
probably won't. You didn't even
probably
buy
won't.
them.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like I'll toot out here, like on RPG.net, there's a review of Moldvay's basic set, and not only do I reread Moldvay's book, I reread the review because it's a review that somebody wrote in 1999 about a 1984 game. So now it's old and double old.
Yeah,
But
wow.
what I liked about it is he talked about how this game from 84 was a lot more accessible than a lot of the 1999 era role-playing games he tried to teach people. And he mentioned that the simplicity of purpose, things were written immediate. There's a lot of top-down writing. It talks to you in a mature way, but it also has a statement of purpose, because they want you to play the game. So he said it was written like an old, like a Monopoly game, like an old school board game where we know you're not going to sit down and read all of these rules, and that's a reason why a lot of like Powered by the Apocalypse got a lot of its strength from having a similar writing style. Everything is very quick, very immediate. Everything works in very definitive terms. It's very old school that way, rather than what I have a tendency to do, and I'm purging myself of, which was writing the long, meticulous rollmaster type language.
All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. That's all for today from the notes for the Aleph. We stream episodes every Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern, and you can join us live on Twitch at twitch.tv/Ractus. We also stream and record weekly tabletop games at the same channel, and you can come join us when we start at 10 a.m., 2 p.m., and 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sundays and Wednesdays. Norman Rafferty here is the owner and writer of Sanguine Games. Check out sanguinegames.com and join us on the Reddit and Twitter. And look forward to the upcoming Book of Corals, Ironclaw expansion book, where you can engage in your very own pirate adventure. And don't forget to check out RedRabbit and Booking for a Game over on startplaying.games as Oracular Pig. And be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and come see us all again. All right, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.